Hey everyone, it's Thomas here, and today I want to talk to you about the nitrogen cycle. Why, you ask? Well, I get a lot of questions about it. Some people, especially newer hobbyists, or anybody keeping an aquarium who hasn't done it before, get a little bit confused when trying to learn about and understand the nitrogen cycle. Even though it's a pretty easy concept once you understand it, it's not super complicated, but just doing a quick Google search and looking at diagrams doesn't work for everybody. Not everybody is a visual learner, and just hearing about it at your local aquarium store from friends also sometimes isn't enough because some people are visual, not just audio learners. So I'm gonna try to mix the two here for you today. I've got a beautiful whiteboard here, which I will draw upon for your viewing pleasure while I explain everything to try to help get you to understand the nitrogen cycle, why it's important, kind of different concepts within the nitrogen cycle, what affects it, the best way to make sure that it is happening correctly, and some of the trials and tribulations you might face while having an aquarium and how you can combat that if they pop up. So let's get this started. Let's learn about the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle, in essence, is a series of biological processes that helps convert the waste that your fish and feeding and other things produce into less harmful substances that are not going to immediately cause your fish extreme harm. That's it, simply put. So what does that look like? What does the nitrogen cycle look like beginning to end? I will show you. So first off, we have our fish. And through respiration and also through feeding, our fish is going to create waste. One of those wastes is exactly what you think it is. It's just excrement or poop. Some of the other wastes are maybe from overfeeding. Also, obviously, the respiration, like I mentioned, is going to cause some ammonia in the water. So that is kind of the next stage of the nitrogen cycle. All that waste is going to turn into something, and that something is ammonia. So the thing about ammonia is that ammonia, also NH3, is very, very dangerous for fish. It is toxic like you wouldn't believe. So, it could cause a lot of distress in your fish just based on that alone. It can poison them, essentially. This is my amazing symbol for poison. NH3 is also very caustic. And what that means is that it will burn. So it's like basically going to burn like an acid. It can cause burning of the gills, which can make it hard for your fish to breathe. It could burn the outside of their scales or skin, which could cause lacerations or burn marks that appear like lacerations. And that can cause secondary infection. And I'm sure you can kind of see now why ammonia is so dangerous. It can poison them, it can burn them, it can cause big problems. So we don't want that. And one of the ways that we kind of get around having the ammonia in the water, other than doing water changes, which yes, you can change the water with new water and that water won't have ammonia, but it will very quickly have ammonia again because your fish are living in it. So we require the help of beneficial bacteria to take that ammonia and break it down into something less harmful. So after ammonia, the beneficial bacteria are going to take over. They're going to consume that ammonia, and the very first thing they're going to turn it into is nitrite, also known as NO2. Now, nitrite is almost as bad as ammonia. It's basically going to cause the same problems. It's toxic, it's caustic, so it is going to make your fish very uncomfortable, unhappy, and once again, it can kill them. So we want to make sure that we get rid of that as quickly as possible. Once again, water changes are an option, but they're not a long-term option. So what we do is, once again, we rely on bacteria to go ahead and convert that terrible nitrite into what we're all used to seeing on our test kits is nitrate, which is the very last stage for all intents and purposes in our aquariums. Nitrate's a lot safer than ammonia or nitrite. It can get to much higher concentrations than those two other substances and still be safe for fish. That said, you really don't want it getting too high. Anything above really 40 parts per million. When you're looking on your test kit, that'll make a lot more sense to you. But 40 parts per million and up can be quite dangerous for most fish. Some fish can tolerate higher. Other fish require it to be lower. So if you have sensitive fish, aim for 20 parts per million or less. But long story short, that is much, much safer. And this is essentially what we're doing when we cycle an aquarium. We're making sure that those two types of bacteria that are nitrifying are in the system and able to convert our fish waste to nitrate so that the environment is stable for the fish and that those harmful substances are taken care of. Now, you know what happens next. You have nitrate in the water. How do you get rid of it? You can do water changes. So the very next thing is water changes. They're very simple to do. They're easy. They're like the staple of keeping aquariums. So we're just going to take the water and we're going to change it out with new water. This is an arrow. Love it. Okay. So I did mention that there are other things that affect the nitrogen cycle, and there are. So number one, let's talk about some of the good things that can affect it. Nitrate is more than just a substance that you want to remove so it doesn't get too high. It is also technically a nutrient for plants. So if you have plants in your system, this is my plants. Look at this plants. Fancy plants, Mr. Fancy Plants. So if you have plants in your system, the plants can also use nitrate. And as long as they're happy and healthy and growing, and depending on how many plants you have, you may find that your nitrates don't get very high because your plants are uptaking a bunch of the nitrates. That's one of the reasons people like to use live plants in their systems, because plants have that beautiful utility of uptaking some of those nutrients that are in the water that you would otherwise have to take out through water changes. Now, if you don't have live plants, that's okay. There's also another way that we can export NO3, and that's with other specialized filtration methods. So I did an episode, which we will link, on a nitrate reactor. And what a nitrate reactor is, in essence, is a very low flow biological filter where there is a lot more CO2 because of the lack of oxygen, the lack of water flow. And because of that, we get denitrifying bacteria. So bacteria that is capable of taking that nitrate and taking it to its last and final step, which is very difficult to do in an aquarium otherwise. And that is nitrogen gas. So it takes nitrate, turns it into nitrogen, and that nitrogen naturally degasses from the aquarium, and it is not toxic to the fish at all. So ultimately, you know, that is what we're all trying to achieve, although, like I mentioned, it's very difficult to achieve because it goes directly against what we're trying to do in our aquarium, which is have high oxygen levels for the fish so that they can breathe and survive and thrive. And what the bacteria require to take that nitrate and turn it into nitrogen gas is CO2. Lots of CO2 and very little oxygen. So you can see how there's kind of a conflict there. So there are specialized filters that will help with that. How effective they are really depends on the setup and all that stuff. It's a little bit more complicated, and not everybody's going to be able to kind of go down that road. It's not practical for everyone. It can be quite expensive. It works a lot better on much larger systems than it does on smaller systems in my experience. So plants are probably a better way if you're trying to naturally remove some nitrate or reduce the amount of water changes that you're doing. So some of the things that can actually add more ammonia to the system, which would be less than ideal. Number one, something that people sometimes don't think about is decaying plant matter. So if you have plants in the system, but they're not doing so well and they're turning brown and yucky and they're dying, that's going to add waste to the system. Another thing that'll add waste to the system that you might not think about is if you have, unfortunately, a fish or fishes or any livestock that perishes. If you don't remove it from the tank, it's going to add ammonia to the system. So all of these things at the end of the day can either cause a spike in ammonia, or they could also cause a spike in nitrate. If you have a very healthy biological filter going on, in the aquarium, you're not really going to worry so much about having an ammonia spike with a situation like that. More often than not, that's going to get converted and you're just going to have a ton of nitrates seemingly out of nowhere, and you don't want that. So it's always important to try and manually remove any dying or decaying plant matter, to clean out your filter often in case it's sucked up some of that matter, and also to make sure you remove any fish or other inhabitants that don't make it. Another thing that could easily cause an ammonia spike is overstocking your aquarium. So if you put way too many fish in a tank that is too small to house that many fish, or maybe the tank is big enough, but the filter you're using on the tank is too small, those can both have the exact same outcome, which is the amount of bacteria in the system is unable to keep up with the amount of ammonia that's being produced. So when people talk about overstocking their tank and their tank crashing, they're talking about the nitrogen cycle in the aquarium that's happening and those bacteria being unable to keep up with the amount of waste that is being produced in that system. So if you have more waste, then you have bacteria to convert that waste, you're going to end up with ammonia. That won't harm the bacteria, but it will harm everything else in the aquarium. So you're going to start having not only nitrate, but you'll start having presence of ammonia and even potentially nitrite. So you can imagine that that would be a terrible, terrible situation. And that's why it's really important not to overstock your tank. And also very important to make sure that you have a good sized filter for your aquarium with enough biological media to support the tank. So for some people, what ends up happening is they get everything running, everything's doing good, they add one fish, they add another fish, several weeks later they add more. They could have that aquarium the way it is for 6 or 7 months, everything's doing great, all of a sudden they add more fish, that's when it happens. So it can be tough to discern exactly when is going to be the tipping point for your aquarium, but a good rule of thumb, again, it's a rule of thumb, is 1 inch of fish per gallon of water. That doesn't account for how messy different species of fish or anything like that are, but if you stick to, in general, having 1 inch of fish per gallon in the aquarium, you in general should not go over that tipping point, provided you have an appropriately sized filter with biological media on that aquarium. So another thing that could affect your entire nitrogen cycle within your tank that you might not even think of is medication. So if you were to use medication in your aquarium, whether it is for treating a fish with a bacterial infection, or perhaps even treating cyanobacteria or blue-green algae, as it's sometimes called, what can happen is that antibiotic could also potentially knock out a portion, or in worst case scenario, all of your beneficial bacteria. And if that happens, obviously the bacteria is no longer converting the ammonia, so ammonia levels in that case are going to very quickly rise. So if that happens, we're in a very, very dangerous place, and that is also a way that you could potentially crash your tank. It's very, very important that you're careful with what medications you use, and sometimes the best case scenario is to put your fish in quarantine and not treat the entire aquarium. That way you can do 100% water changes or whatever's necessary in that quarantine system while you're medicating to make sure you don't have ammonia issues. But yeah, that is something that people often don't consider. If you put medication in that's going to kill bacteria, it is very likely that it will kill more than the bad bacteria that is affecting your fish. It could also kill off your good bacteria and cause your tank crash, and we don't want that. Another thing that people don't realize that could cause your tank to crash or kill off your beneficial bacteria is if in your filter here you decide to do some maintenance and you take your filter to your sink, that is a sink, don't judge, and you wash your biological media directly in tap water. That tap water, more often than not, is going to have chlorine and or chloramine in it, and both of those kill bacteria, which is why our municipalities put that in the tap water to start with. If you rinse off your biological media full of beneficial bacteria in chlorine or chloramine-filled water, you are going to kill off that beneficial bacteria. So when you put that filter back on your tank, most of the bacteria in your aquarium that are responsible for making sure that the nitrogen cycle is moving as it should be and converting all that nasty into nitrate, which is far safer, it won't be there, and you're going to end up having a lot of ammonia and nitrite. So you cannot, under any circumstance, take your biological media from your filter and rinse it under tap water. It's always best to get a separate bucket, take some water from your aquarium, and just shake it off, rinse it off, move it around in that water, dislodge any debris, put it back, right back into the filter, right back onto your tank where it can continue doing what it does best. So to recap, inhabitants in your aquarium are going to cause waste. That waste is going to become ammonia. Very dangerous. Beneficial bacteria, however, in our filters can help remove that waste by turning it into nitrite, which allows another beneficial bacteria to take that nitrite and turn it into much safer nitrate, which is not as dangerous for our fish. We then take that out through water changes. Some of it may be taken out by plants in our aquariums and represented as a dotted line because it's pretty hard to achieve, but possible. Specialized filtration can house denitrifying bacteria that will then break that down into nitrogen, which is perfectly safe as it is inert and leaves the system. However, there are some considerations of things that can mess this whole thing up. Overfeeding your tank or leaving uneaten food can cause an ammonia spike, especially if your bacteria is not built up to a level that can handle all of that extra ammonia. Too many fish in the aquarium can also push the limit of your filtration and the volume of water in the aquarium past the point that the bacteria can remove that ammonia, so that could be an issue. A small filter, just like the point I just made, if it doesn't house enough beneficial bacteria, that waste is going to turn into ammonia. Tap water is dangerous because if you take your biological media from your filter full of beneficial bacteria, you could kill it off because of the chlorine and chloramines in the tap water, meaning you are going to erase the bacteria, which means you're just going to end up with a bunch of ammonia. Antibiotics, which people don't often think about in fish medication, can obviously damage the bacteria in your filter, causing the exact same issue. No beneficial bacteria means a lot of ammonia. And then obviously dying, dead plants and or fish and other inhabitants in the tank, if you do not remove them, could potentially cause ammonia faster than your filter can take care of, and then throw everything out of whack, causing a huge ammonia spike. So I know what you're thinking now. You've got a pretty good grasp of how this works. But what happens when you end up in a situation where you have a lot of ammonia or nitrite in the water and your beneficial bacteria clearly aren't handling the situation the way they're supposed to? Number one, if you're reading ammonia on a test strip or test kit or nitrite, that is in a level that is not safe for your fish, the number one thing you should do, the very first thing, is a pretty decent sized water change. If it's in the danger zone already, you're going to want to change at least 50% of your water. You may find that right after you change your water, you're still reading some ammonia if you test within the next 15 minutes or so. If that happens and it's still in the danger zone, you can do another 50% water change to then try to dilute that further. The whole idea is you want to get it to a safe spot for your fish and then address the issue further from there. So the next thing you're going to want to do is make sure everything is as it should be. So if you realize, oh, I made a mistake, I washed my filter media in tap water, you know what happened. If you find that you just added a bunch of fish recently, you obviously added too many at once, or maybe your system just can't handle that many fish, and then you know where your problem is as well. Once you've diagnosed what the issue is, you can kind of take steps towards treating it. So in the situation where you have too many fish, obviously you're going to have to reduce the bioload in the tank or get a much larger filter with extra biomedia and add some beneficial bacteria to the tank through liquid additives. There's tons of liquid additives out there to help rejuvenate the amount of bacteria in the tank or add new species of nitrifying and denitrifying bacteria to the tank. And essentially help everything get stabilized. These kinds of products are things like Big Al's BioSupport, Hagen Cycle, Python BioSupport. There's also Seachem Stability. There's tons of different products out there that help with this. So adding some of that to the tank is definitely going to help establish more bacteria in the aquarium a little bit faster. It's not going to hurt to have it in there. So essentially, you just want to get rid of as much of the ammonia and nitrite as possible to keep your fish safe while you address why there isn't enough bacteria to deal with the amount of waste that is in the system. That's exactly how straightforward it is. Treating it and diagnosing it is a little bit more complicated, but That's also why we've got a comment section down below. So if you have any questions on this topic, the nitrogen cycle, maybe I missed something, or you have a very specific question you'd like to ask, drop it down there. I'd love to get back to you. That's what I'm here for, to help out. And if you'd like to, maybe reach out to us on social media like Facebook. You can also check out our Instagram, where we've got a lot of beautiful aquatic eye candy for you to check out. And, maybe subscribe. And, let me know what other topics you'd like me to cover in this format, and I'll get to them. And if you're subscribed, you'll see when they pop up, and you'll be like, oh, I asked that question. And I'm glad he answered it, because now I can keep on taking with new information that you didn't previously have. Maybe you already had it. Maybe you just needed a refresher. So let's take a look at the whole thing. I'm going to show you the nitrogen cycle visually. I drawed words.